All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Barrick, the Wargaming Director at Marine Corps University. And this afternoon, we've got a pretty special event. We are kicking off our Fight Club tournament with WARPLAN 44 that kicks off today. And, we're going to do something that we have not done before, which is have one of our professors here give a historical background to the scenario that we're fighting in this tournament. So we're privileged this afternoon that we've got Dr. Mike Morris with us from the School of Advanced Warfighting. And just a quick background on Dr. Morris. So he's a graduate of the Naval Academy. He's a retired Marine colonel, artillery background, and a number of tours over the years, ranging from 10th Marines to 6th Marines. Also an assistant, I found this one interesting, an assistant fire support officer with the Army 75th Ranger Regiment. So pretty interesting there. Time as a planner with 1MEF during Iraqi freedom. And then, he also commanded, he was in artillery battery in 10th Marines, inspector instructor with 3rd Anglico, also expeditionary warfare training group. And then he rounded out his time in his career as the director of the School of Advanced Warfighting. From an education standpoint, besides the Naval Academy, has gone through the Marine Command and Staff College, American Military University, Army War College, School of Advanced Warfighting, and then most recently got his PhD from Texas A&M. He also has published his first book with Kansas Press just this year. So congratulations, Mike, on that. That is called Core Competency, and it's about the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force Marine headquarters in Vietnam from 1965-1971. So, and of note also, his research interests, he's got this in his bio, which I think is very appropriate for our topic today. His interest is in campaign planning, Corps level operations, Marine Corps history, small arms and amphibious operations. So, Mike, thank you very much for joining us today. Our format here, just so everybody is tracking, our format is going to be Mike presenting through this in a lecture style format for however long, Mike, it takes you to go through this. Feel free to take your time, anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes, whatever you want to take. And then what we're going to do is open it up for some questions and discussions. So I really encourage the group on here, if you've got any questions that you want to bring up or anything you would like to just bring up as a discussion point, please feel free to do that. And with that, Mike, let me hand the mic over to you. Floor is yours. And you're muted at the moment, Mike. I'm sorry about that. I may have overrode you. If I did, I apologize. I hit mute for all. Are you able to unmute from your end?
How about now?
Yep, gotcha. Okay.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you to talk a little bit about COBRA this afternoon. Here at SAW, we focus on campaign planning, as Tim mentioned, and the core level of command, that echelon is our sweet spot, because this is the highest combat formation that the Marine Corps fields in our MEFs. And so we spend a lot of time looking at what it means to be a warfighter at that particular level of command. And I think this case study we're looking at today is a formative one at a number of different levels. It certainly goes well above Corps, but the Corps commanders are making some of the key reads, and we will highlight that as we move through the material. My goal is to just hit some of the high points of this campaign, at least in this first part, and then during the discussion afterwards, we could certainly take this wherever the group is interested in maybe spending some more time or going down to a different level of detail. And I'll try to throw in a little bit of analysis on the planning and execution of the campaign as we go through the first part as well. We're going to look briefly at plans. We're going to take a quick look at the lodgment, the breakout proper, German counterattack at Mortain, and then the way the battle at Falaise Gap played out. I think overall, COBRA is a really interesting case and one worth examining because it was one of the most important, certainly, U.S. operations in all of World War II, in terms of both its conduct and its outcomes. I'd like to start with a little bit of just background on the plans. Of course, at the macro level, once the United States is drawn into the Second World War, and in Europe in particular, their goal is to fight the Germans and get the Germans to sort of wind their neck in. And the primary way to do that initially is to keep the Russians in the war. The Soviet Union is super important. The Americans are fully focused on fighting till the last Russian if necessary. And in order to do that, they're going to do two things. One of them is to continue the Lend-Lease program as robustly as possible. And secondly, is to get back into the offensive game as quickly as they can. So we see that transpire in North Africa with Torch and all the way across through North Africa, and then up into Sicily and Italy early on in the war, before the Americans and the British feel like they have the strength to be able to go after the Germans directly in the heart of Europe by invading France. During this early period of the war, 41 even before the Americans are in the war, and then into 42 and 43, there's a whole host of plans that are focused by the Allies that are focused on getting the Allied force back onto the continent. That includes Roundup, which was designed to disrupt a German withdrawal if there was some kind of collapse in the war's final phases. So this was 41 to 43. An operation called Sledgehammer, which was a limited attack plan in 1942 to exploit a collapse in German morale, or maybe just a sacrifice play to help the Russians if something was really going wrong on the Eastern Front. Bolero was the name of the plan that really built up the American presence in the UK. But the primary actor during this period is a three-star British general whose name was Frederick Morgan. And Morgan led an organization called Cossack, which was their whole charter was to develop the plan to get back onto the across the Channel and into France. And initially that looked like 4 assault divisions with another 6 or so in follow-up, about almost 9,000 ships and landing craft, 18 commando battalions, 4 airborne divisions, and so on. It was Morgan and his band of merry men that created the initial plan that was then handed off in late 43, early 44 for General Eisenhower once he was announced as the Supreme Commander, and his new staff, including Monty and the rest, Bradley and so on, to take a look at and refine that plan between January and May of 1944, May being the month when the invasion was scheduled to take place. And of course, it was bumped due to weather for another month into June, as we know. Just a note on names. Overlord is the name of the overall invasion operation. Neptune as a code name is really the assault phase, and any version of the Overlord plan that included a target area and a date was called Neptune. So just as background with respect to, let's see if we can get the thing moving here. Here we go. Just as background for this Overlord plan, I pulled a map out of the MCDP 1 Tech 2 campaigning doctrinal publication, and this map shows the sort of concept level plan for the invasion of France, and more importantly, driving all the way to the heart of Germany in the industrial heartland. You see from this map that the arrows go on either side, coming across the Channel, on either side of Paris, with another arrow joining from the south of France in an operation that would later become known as Anvil Dragoon. And between these eras to advance on a broad front on multiple axes to be able to target, again, the industrial heartland and then all the way to Berlin as required in order to get to meet the Russians in the middle or to drive and do it ourselves with respect to defeat criteria for Germany proper. The reason why this little map is important is because it shows the recognition, couple things. It shows the recognition that there would be little chance that the war would be decided without one or both of the Russian and Western Allied armies going into the heart of Germany and overthrowing the regime. In order to do that, obviously, from the Westerners' perspective, a lodgment is required, and that's what Overlord is all about. So the second thing that's important to realize is that the strategy for destroying the German army in Northwest Europe looks a lot like this. It is not Neptune or Overlord proper. All that Overlord is a way to get a foothold on France in order to start the campaign headed towards Berlin. Now, this map shows an overview of the area just in general that we are going to be talking about. You see Paris down here in the lower right quadrant, the English Channel. So it's basically the Seine River line up to the coast, out to the Cotentin Peninsula, down to the Brittany Peninsula, and then back all the way to the east to the Seine River line again, south of Paris. And this is the quadrant that we are going to be talking about largely. And actually, it's a much smaller area of this, which the subsequent maps will show. And if you follow my cursor, it's pretty much this area that is running from Avranches over to Argentan and then up to Caen and out to Cherbourg. And that's the battle space that most of what we'll be spending our time on today is focused on, with just the reminder that this is lodgment only and not actually the plan that is going to see to the ultimate defeat of the German army. This map is, I think, particularly important, this phase line map. This is one of their original planning documents, and it shows the 21st Army Group's estimate of when they thought they would achieve this lodgment that we just described. So you see that by D+90, they expect that they're going to be all the way up to the Seine River line with the full Army group. And this was predicated, of course, on British and American armies. As we know, over time, those armies expanded until you have multiple army groups under Eisenhower's supreme command. But if you're looking for a kind of a money slide in a presentation on planning, this is a good one because it shows forces and space and time phased out. And so you see that with a 6 June 1944 landing date, by early September, they expect to be all the way up to Paris with the lodgment firmly established and the logistic throughput beginning to operate all the way from the coast up to the line of contact with the German forces. Let's talk a little bit now about this lodgment. Here you see basically the beachhead line of the final Overlord plan. This map is out of the Green Book series, which is a wonderful resource, especially their mapping products, for much of what we are going to be talking about this afternoon. What you see here is a good overview of the final beachhead line and the forces that were designed to come in between 1st U.S. Army and 2nd British Army into what we now know as that Normandy area. So Omaha Beach, the famous Omaha Beach, is here, Utah off to the west, and then the British beaches further off to the east, out to the Cherbourg Peninsula. Cherbourg being here. You see Caen down here anchoring the British shoulder to the east of the incursion of the lodgment area. So there's a lot of factors that are influencing the decisions about Overlord. And so if we were just to ask why here, why Normandy, it would include things like beach capacity. including not only how much tonnage could go over it, but also the exits, air coverage, ports. They needed at least one major port, and they were planning on that being Cherbourg. In the end, they found that they didn't need as much port capacity as they had anticipated. They thought they were going to need all the ports of Brittany. That turned out not to be the case either, but ports were a major factor driving Normandy as a target area. Then there was the fact that they knew they were going to need airfields. So within the first month or so, they knew, and which means not much further than this line is driven right now. If we were to go back to that phase line, within that first 30 days, they were looking to have built 27 airfields in the first 30 days. When all was said and done, it came down to a choice, for the most part, between the Pas-de-Calais, which is the area across from Dover and the shortest reach across the English Channel, and this space here that we're looking at on this chart. And it's interesting to think about this, because if you're a planner and you're thinking, where am I going to land? And you know that you can sort of boil it down to just a few most likely, most effective objectives. It's a wonder that the enemy doesn't arrive at the same conclusion. What's odd is that partly because of the deception, we know of Operation Fortitude, which is the great Allied deception, played a major role in that. But nonetheless, the Germans were very focused on the Pas-de-Calais, and that's where the strongest fortifications and strongest armor forces and all the rest were. This, by comparison, was a weakly held sector of the German defense. And it's just interesting that one of the few people who guessed correctly on this from the German perspective was Hitler himself, but too late to be able to do much about it in terms of changing force structure and fortifications. So from the Allied perspective, there's a ton of things that they're thinking about. Key decisions included how much force is going to be necessary, where are we going to land, when are we going to land, both the season and the actual date. How are we going to employ airborne forces? Are we going to emphasize power or stealth? Does this commander, in this case Eisenhower, is he going to be just a kind of a JTF commander overall, or is he also going to be what we might think of as a CFLIC or a land component commander at the same time? What did they learn from the Pacific experience and their previous Mediterranean experience? How much fire support is required? What should the depth of the initial assault be? What role should the French resistance play? What about deception? And then, of course, concepts for employing air power. We can explore any number of those in the discussion afterwards, if you like, but I'll just mention two briefly. That's the first question, is how much is enough with respect to force? And the second one is how employ air power. How much force? An amphibious assault can be defined as a race to build up combat power. And if that's true, then it's not just incumbent to get as much force ashore as quickly as possible, but to win that race to build up the combat power. Morgan's initial estimates, and this actually didn't change much in the year or so between his plan and the one that was executed, was that this lodgment could survive no more than 2 or 3 mobile or armored divisions attacking right away within the first day or two. They expected that by a week or so out, they would have anywhere between 9, and then later estimates were more like 14 divisions that could be in and around this lodgment area. But all in all, they thought that they could probably not prosper against more than about 12 mobile divisions in all of France, which of course famously led Stalin to ask, well, you know, what happens if there's 13 or X plus 1? And in the end, they did face more than they had anticipated. In May of 1944, Rundstedt, who's the kind of German theater commander, has got 10 panzer divisions and 14 to 17 either infantry or parachute divisions available in order to employ. So this was a major challenge. And originally, Morgan's plan called for only 3 assault divisions amphibiously. And this was bumped up to 5 for the June 44 assault, coupled with 3 airborne divisions, with another 35 or 40 in the UK ready to make the leap across the channel as soon as they were necessary. What's interesting about that is that Sicily, actually Operation Husky in Sicily, from the Allied perspective, had a larger assault contingent than Normandy, which is just something to think about. 7 assault divisions, 3 US, 4 British and Canadian, plus several armor brigades, lots of Rangers and commandos, and some airborne units as well. The second thing I wanted to highlight with respect to the lodgment is air power. And the major question here of many was, how are we going to use the heavies, the heavy bombers? Obviously, the combined bomber offensive, the CBO, was a major ongoing operation that was targeting deep strategic target sets like oil refineries and ball bearing plants and so on. But Ike wanted to take that capacity for bombing and move it closer to support the lodgment, to make it, in other words, a supporting effort used as a shaping or an interdiction tool. So this particular target looked a lot more like transportation networks up close, like rail marshaling yards and bridges and tunnels, and even train plinking, as well as some port and airfield destruction. And he got Eisenhower, after a series of contentious arguments across the entire joint force, he got his desire. And from about mid-April, his deputy for air was able to direct the employment of the heavy bombers in support of the shaping operations. What's funny about this is that the major Air Force commanders couldn't agree on whether what Ike wanted to do was possible, and if it was, how long it might take. Doolittle, for example, General Doolittle, thought that it could be done in as little as 3 weeks, whereas Spaatz, another major voice in this debate, said that it couldn't be done at all. But in fact, it worked out pretty well in terms of delaying German reserves, which is mainly what Eisenhower was focused on. For example, rail traffic in this region of France decreased 60% between 1 March and 6 June 1944. And it's important to remember that mostly we're talking about heavy bombers here being repurposed to do this. Obviously, the fighter bombers and the medium bombers were at work as well. And let's remember that 9th Tactical Air Force under Allied Expeditionary Air Forces held medium bombers, fighters, air service troops, troop carrier commands, and the rest. So there was something like 2,500 fighters and nearly 1,000 bombers between the Americans and the Brits available to support tactical operations in addition to what the heavies could bring to bear. Now let's turn for a moment and look at what the Germans are up to. This laydown is pretty much what they had arrayed across all of France on D-Day. And you'll see that there's 2 armies here in Army Group B. You have 7th and 15th. This is the Pas-de-Calais area that we were discussing earlier. And then, of course, when we get down here, this is our target area that the actual invasion is taking place on, just near the border between 7th and 15th Armies. Whereas further south, we have the 1st Army arrayed and the 19th Army. This is the area where Anvil Dragoon is going to come ashore. So we have 4 armies and all these different map icons for various divisions. You'll see that the division icons that are clean are static or stationary divisions, and then the others are your mobile divisions, although not the kind of mobility you might find on the Eastern Front. The big debate here is between Rommel, who was the youngest field marshal, and Rundstedt, who was the oldest field marshal in the German forces, about how to respond with their reserves. Rommel, based on his experience in North Africa, felt that the German armor reserves needed to be close and spread out, or they'd never survive the Allied air interdiction effort. Rundstedt, less experienced with this, wanted to hold back a much larger chunk of the German armor at basically army level as a counterattack force. And since they didn't know where they were going to make a main effort, the Allies, Rundstedt's reserve, his army level reserve, would have been much further away from the coast. This was the challenge. Hitler solved this, like Solomon, by splitting the baby between the 2 approaches. He wound up giving 3 panzer divisions to Rommel, 4 to OB West, 3 down to Army Group G on the Mediterranean coast, and so on. So they're just sprinkled all over the place. And the problem with this is they weren't able to create the mass and the tempo required once the Allies revealed their hand on the Normandy coast. Really what this argument is about is it's an argument in support of the value of air superiority, because in the end, that's what's driving this consideration. Runstead's approach makes a lot of sense if you're talking about a situation of air parity, but that didn't exist in France in the spring of 1944. What the Allies were proposing was basically a penetration or a breakthrough operation. And what history had taught up to that point was that the best way to blunt or stop that was through a defense in depth. The Germans, however, and when we say that, we're talking about somewhere between 5 and 15 kilometers of depth all the way across the front, which means all the way around the coast. And they had nowhere near the force structure available as depicted here to be able to do that. For example, many of these static divisions, which was their first bid for success, were somewhere between 50 and up to 200 miles apart, depending on the sector of the defense. And 84th Corps, which was one of the German corps we're going to look at here in just a moment as we zero in at Normandy, had a frontage of almost 250 miles with less than 8 divisions. So that's about 30 miles a division, and that is not the kind of frontage you want to fight a defense in depth. Hitler was unwilling to put more forces into France, even though some were available. For example, if you'll look out here on the Channel Islands, you'll see that there was divisions out here up to about 40,000 troops, which spent the rest of the war out there and never actually got involved in the fighting because they were marooned once Normandy went down. They misread the intel, as we've already talked about, thinking the Allies would come ashore here at the Pas-de-Calais. But Runstead, who's got all of this working under him for OB West, has still got 58 divisions by late May of 1944. Most of those, 33 or so, were static divisions. About 24 were mobile, but they weren't as mobile as they would have liked, dependent still heavily on horses and bikes and other things. They weren't all Mark I Mod 0 Panzer divisions for sure. Their tanks were up to about 1,600 in this area that's on the chart here, but that's not nearly enough for the space that they were looking at. And by late spring of 44, the Germans fielded 380 divisions total. That includes German as well as 66 Allied divisions. And of that number, there were more divisions in the Balkans and Scandinavia together than were in all of France. And Hitler was unwilling to redeploy any of that force, or much of it, to France. So only about 15% of the total German strength measured in divisions was on this map in front of us here as the Allies came ashore. Bottom line is the Germans faced a tough problem given the resources that were available. All right. So we're going to go back and talk about the breakout a little bit. And I want to just highlight that we're not going to spend a lot of time over here on the British side of the equation, but this city of Caen was the Emerald City that was forever just out of reach during this period. And there was a lot of heavy fighting. This ground, if you've walked it, is also much better ground in terms of open and rolling hills, better tank country, which is why the British and the Germans thought that would be where decision would be found. If you go this way, you get into the famous Bocage area of Normandy, and that's just really tough sledding for any kind of mobile force at all. I just want to highlight one operation. Obviously, Overlord is not the only game in town. So Epsom and Goodwood and others were involved, or efforts by the Allies to be able to punch their way out of this bridgehead. Goodwood's a particularly interesting one, so we'll just take a quick peek at that. This is out of one of the Osprey books, and what it shows you on the British side is essentially a corps in this pocket just over the river, another one here in the main part of the city, and then a whole reserve corps of all armor divisions under O'Connor. And the idea was they were going to come break through this area, bust all the way out to this ridge line, and then open the way, kind of be the can opener that would open the way for the rest of the force to follow. Sadly for the British, it didn't exactly work out that way. Here you see the line that they actually gained as opposed to the one that they were looking for. And this fell victim to a very deep defense in depth, an entire armor corps, 1st SS Panzer Corps that was a tactical counterattack force, and a bevy of German 88s and other anti-tank capability that shot up an enormous quantity of British tanks during this short assault of just a day or two. What makes this interesting, and Steve Biddle does a nice analytical chapter on this particular operation in his book called Military Power, is that if you were going to put your chips on an operation to break out of the Normandy beachhead, this would have been the one most logical. Because of the force ratios, the armor, it was accompanied by a heavy bombardment, and yet it failed. And it failed because of a German defense in depth that was both stationary and mobile at the same time. All of these little areas here that you see with the half moons around them are basically villages that were turned into defense nests. So this was a tough thing for the British, and in the end, it didn't work out anything like what they had hoped it would. So then they moved to the other side of the lodgement area, and we see where the actual COBRA breakout takes place all the way out to the west. This is the bomb box that was targeted. This is 7th Corps, which is the main effort. 7th Corps, in the end, made this attack with 6 divisions, which is, in many armies, would be considered army size. It's an enormous force with multiple armor divisions, multiple infantry divisions. And the goal here is basically to open either end of this bomb box with the shoulder, then punch through the middle. The goal for the early part of COBRA is Coutances as an aim point. They were going to run down this ridge line in this road in order to be able to block this whole area off. And so the goal was to take out all of these forces, to surround them and either capture or destroy these forces, take them off the game board. By doing that, obviously, you've opened up this entire sector for the other corps, in this case, 8th Corps off to the west, and then later 3rd Army when it stands up on 1 August, to come rushing through this gap and be able to exploit onto the Brittany Peninsula and beyond to that phase line that we looked at D+90. So that's the basic idea with respect to the penetration. They're looking to nab about 17,000 Germans, probably less than 100 tanks altogether spread across this zone. Here you see Panzer Lehr, which had a lot of the tanks right up front and not back as a counterattack force. And many of those tanks were destroyed in the initial bombardment. Because the terrain is bocage mostly, they didn't really expect, the Germans, that this was going to be a main effort sector, and that was one of the reasons why it was as lightly defended as it was vis-a-vis the section that we were just looking at around Caen. So some of the critical questions included, how are they going to use strategic bombers? Well, not surprisingly, Eisenhower elects to use them again. 1,800 heavy bombers, 400 medium, 350 fighter bombers, are blasting this 6 square mile box for about 2 hours. This is not the first time. It had been done in Italy around Cassino in February, March, and May. It's done again in Normandy later in July and twice more in August. So they're working on these techniques and tactics, but they fall short here. They attack this direction instead of parallel to the flot, and that means that many of the aircraft drop short. There's a number of casualties, including Leslie McNair, which is the highest ranking American general to die in World War II. The result of this, however, is that something like somewhere between 10% and up to as much of a third of the main line of resistance forces in this bomb box are either killed, wounded, or completely neutralized because they're basically dazed. Nonetheless, there's enough fight left in the German backups and those who did survive to keep this from going quickly. So at the end of the first day, there's still basically this 7th Corps attack force at the line of departure. And within a few days, they're still not that far inland, and we'll look at that. Yet 84th Corps, which is at this corps here to the west of this line, is largely smashed. 2nd Paracorps to the east has also been badly damaged. And 7th Army in general in this whole sector is largely defeated because of this thrust. One of the key reads by Collins, who's the Corps commander for 7th Corps, is when to commit his reserve, if you will. And he does that almost right away. And he says that the trigger for him is because of the lack of coordination of the German reaction, and in particular, the fact that they didn't counterattack as quickly as they normally would have, which he attributed to a loss of cohesion. So in this attack zone, which is less than 5 miles, you find, again, 6 divisions. So a tremendous massing of force and tremendous firepower, not just the armor, but also almost 700 tubes of artillery, which is putting an equal amount of fire down at roughly the same time as the aerial bombardment. So for this slide, I just want to highlight, we're now a couple of days into this breakout. This is our bomb box here, which you can see. It's a busy slide, but you can see the bomb box. And then you can just start to see how these columns, most of them are combat commands or mobile troops, are starting to move out. And you notice that they're not just heading to croutons, but they're going into gaps that they find, and not just the ones that were pre-programmed. So they are exploiting the lack of cohesion of the German defense. Here it is for the next 2 days, the 28th and the 29th, and you see that it's just broadening out a little bit, and these fingers are working their way all the way towards the coast. They're stopping roughly along this line in order to allow this corridor for 8th Corps to be able to flow down these roads and further south in order to be able to round the bend around Avranches. Interestingly, 1st Army claims in their after action that this whole operation was handled competently, but with no special brilliance, as they put it, in terms of a penetration and then an exploitation, which was what we're seeing here. This is the continuation of that exploitation all the way down towards Avranches. This is San Malo down here out in the bay. So the Germans are falling back, and the Allies are just pushing forward across the whole front. And we'll see what that looks like on this scale map, which is picking up on the 1st of August. I think you could argue that on or around the 1st of August is when the actual pursuit phase starts, because what happens is you see how the German lines are and how they fall back to this line here. And then there's this gap right here. And that gap, once they pass through it, into Brittany in one direction and then south and then again back to the east in the other direction, is when the pursuit phase actually starts. The Germans are, of course, looking to reestablish a line, and they want this line to be reconnected. Hitler, in his mind, thinks that they will then reattack back towards the Normandy coastline and wipe out the whole invasion force. But that is a distant dream. They don't have nearly enough force to do that. So instead, what happens is the Germans put together a corps-level counterattack force, which centers on or around the town of Mortain. And Mortain is just about 20 miles or so east of the bay at Avranches in San Malo. You can see one from the other. And the Germans on the 7th of August, 1944, launched this corps-sized counterattack, which initially catches the Americans by surprise. And you can see these long fingers go out, but there wasn't enough mass behind these to be able to sustain them. And 7th Corps, by the end of this day and the next day, is at 7 divisions. And there's a lot more behind that. So one of the things, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this counterattack peters out. There's some interesting stories about the formation, the battalion that's surrounded here on the high ground and so on. They were basically observers for brigades worth of field artillery that were just smashing these attack vectors. But Essentially, the Germans simply couldn't match the defensive mass that the Americans were able to deploy, both in armor and artillery and air. The Typhoons ran 300 sorties around this little town alone and killed a lot of tanks that way on the 8th of August. But it didn't take long for this to expire. And one of the reasons is because First Army in all of its glory was right behind 7th Corps. And for you, what that means is that, First Army had 3 corps, 10 divisions, but in addition to those 10 divisions and 3 corps, they had 333 battalions worth of combat power, which if you measure 20 battalions to a division is about 16 divisions worth of additional corps level combat power. So there was no chance that 3, 4, or even 5 Panzer divisions, depleted already, are going to be able to break through all the way to the coast and hold that line and reestablish this gap that they were hoping to be able to plug with this counterattack. Here's Mortain. So the Mortain counterattack fails, and what happens next is what's known as the Falaise Gap or the Falaise Pocket, because the Germans have essentially shifted combat power far to the west, and now the Americans have put forces down to their southern flank quickly. And we're talking major forces, Army, multiple corps, so Army-sized forces are all the way over here on the shoulders of this huge pocket. It's not actually that huge. It's only about 10, 15 miles across and, maybe twice that in depth. And this is, in fact, a real problem for the Germans, because inside this pocket they have 2 armies, including 6 corps, that are potentially going to be trapped if the Allies can move forward to some middle point on both sides. So we have the Canadians and the British and the Poles moving in this direction, and the Americans moving in this direction. There is a whole series of challenges associated with this operation, including C2 and fire support coordination and just high-level general officers that don't like each other, not cooperating very well. But in the end, what happens is they fail to close this gap completely. And so like a tube of toothpaste, as the Allies continue to shrink this pocket, they are spurting out here, basically between Troon and Chambois. And their combat patrols, like patrol size, link up here at Chambois. But this gap right here is left largely open, and over a series of nights, a good chunk of the German army is able to slip through, aided by a corps-level counterattack from the north, and then eventually retire all the way behind the Seine River line to begin to reform. So there is a lot of controversy associated with this operation. It is both triumphant on one level and also the one that got away on another. But it's important to kind of put this in perspective. For example, 6 of the 7 armor divisions that supposedly escaped only totaled about 2,000 men, 62 tanks, and 26 guns. 220 tanks, 160 self-propelled guns, 700 towed guns, 130 AAA guns, 130 half-tracks, 5,000 cars and trucks, and 2,000 wagons were destroyed. And a large chunk of the German army was also either killed, wounded, or captured as this pocket collapsed. What did get away, and this is important, are much of the stabs at the division, corps, and army level. And that became, of course, the nucleus as the German army reformed behind the West Wall eventually and continued the fight on into 1945. But it was still a major accomplishment. So between 6 June D-Day and September, the Germans have lost 5 panzer divisions totally destroyed, 6 mauled and nearly destroyed, 20 infantry divisions destroyed, and another 12 basically severely damaged. 3 divisions are trapped in Brittany. 1 is stuck on the Channel Islands. They've lost 400,000 killed or wounded or prisoner. Half of those are prisoners, by the way, many of them taken in this pocket. 1,300 tanks, 20,000 trucks, 500 assault guns, 1,500 pieces of artillery captured or destroyed, 2,300 aircraft destroyed in the air, and another almost 1,200 on the ground, almost 3,500 aircraft destroyed just in this 2-month period. So what's interesting here is that the German army has suffered catastrophically, and yet their will to fight has not yet been broken. You could even argue that at this stage, after Falaise, the German army had suffered as much destruction as it had, say, after the 100 Days in 1918. And yet, at that point, the politicians decided that the war would be over. Here, you have Hitler still in charge, and he is not yet ready to throw in the towel, and never would be. So the fight goes on into 1945. I would just say, by way of a wrap-up commentary, that we began by saying this is just to establish a lodgment, and it did indeed attain that goal, no doubt about that. It wasn't designed to destroy the German army proper, although obviously they were hoping that would take place. There's basically 4 ways to kill an army. The first way is through attrition, and we see that in the cataclysmic battles that went on before COBRA took place, all the way across the Normandy lodgment area and that frontage. So that's attrition. The second way is through a siege. We saw that at Cherbourg, which was the port, and also the Brittany ports. A third way is through pursuit. That's what you see in the lead up to this battle here in the Falaise Gap. And the fourth way is with a decisive battle in the field that looks like a Cannae or a Sedan 1870 or a Jena, Austerlitz, something like that. So the Americans and the Brits and their allies nearly pulled that off here at Falaise, and you could argue largely did. They call it a pocket battle or a cauldron battle, and most or a good chunk of the German army in France was done in by one of those 4 ways between June 6th and the end of August 1944. That's just useful to remember as you play your game. You're looking to take pieces off the table, and those 4 ways are the primary ways that tends to happen. And what's interesting for Normandy is that all 4 of them were at play during this 3-month operation. I'll pause there and invite questions and discussion and just general feedback or comments from the group.
Hey, Dr. Morris, thank you very much for that, and really appreciate you doing this. And that was spot on in terms of relevance to the scenario that we've got going here. So a lot of great planning background that you've given us on that. So I'll kick off with a question, and then for those in the group here, please feel free to either put a question in the chat, or once we finish this first question, if you want to come up on the mic, you're welcome to do that as well. But my question goes, when you fight this campaign from the German side, it is really challenging. And there's a very clear decision point where, you're defending forward up there on the lines. And then at some point in the course of the campaign, you just can't hold the Allies anymore. That's generally what happens. And you have to fall back. So I'm curious if you could speak to, once they do start falling back, do they have a plan for like the Seine River line? Do they end up holding that at all? Do they end up just falling all the way back across France? It definitely, as the German player in this, from the German side and perspective, you're struggling with where to go, because you have a nice short line at the peninsula going coast to coast. And then once you lose that line and you start falling back, you just have this wide open, flank, and trying to set a line, you just don't have the forces to do it. So could you speak to the point where the line breaks, and now you're the German commander and you've got to decide, how far back do you go? And you said the West Wall, but did they have any intermediate lines of defense to kind of forestall it, or did they just know that at that point it's a lost cause in terms of France?
They did not have the kinds of fallback positions built in France that you see in Italy, where there were at least they had them planned in Italy. They didn't develop all of them, but Lord knows that Gustav and the Gothic in Italy took us, the better part of 2 years. So that was bad enough. But there were like 30 lines in Italy. They didn't have that series of lines. The rivers are obviously, you know, the primary place, but you nailed it in your observation. If you look at this chart and you see the reason they were so keen to reestablish this is because this is even after this breakthrough at Cobra, this is the shortest line that they can defend. And once this is broken, now you're back to the Sin River line is long, and it's not a particularly strong line in many ways. And while, you know, some of the other rivers that have figured prominently in World War I are certainly out there, the Somme and others are available, but there's not a great place to go at that point unless you go all the way back to the German border, and they know that, and that's why I think Hitler was even more willing than some of his commanders to make this bid. He was a little bit out of touch with respect to the battlefield conditions, and these forward commanders knew exactly how forlorn this hope was, not just to get down here and reestablish connection across the gap, but then to counterattack back towards the beachhead was really just not reasonable. So all that said, there were a series of plans, but what keeps happening is that the Germans are overcome by events. So the Americans and their allies are just moving too quickly. And so, for example, at one point, the Seventh Army and actually it's mostly Seventh, but also elements of Fifth, and they're going to establish a corps-sized counterattack that was designed to grab.
Hey, Mike, you got muted there, and just you could try to hit it from your end.
You left off when you're talking about the core size counter.
Yeah, sorry, Mike. Not sure what happened there. You able to do it from your end? Hmm. I'm looking here, Mike, for an option. Now this is a bummer. Jay, you happen to have expertise in. There we go. Got it.
Okay, thank you. So bottom line was they were just a day late and $1 short. They couldn't launch that counterattack because it was just about a day or two too late to do what they were looking to do. And the force ratios had changed by the time they were able to deploy. Last thing I'd say is that the Germans did, despite the cataclysmic losses in the pocket, they executed that withdrawal about as well as I think it could be done. They had a 40-mile withdrawal. They had 4 rivers. They were doing about 10 miles a day, and they were taking as much equipment as they could. But you can imagine what a shooting gallery it was with all these forces arrayed all the way around that pocket, both artillery, direct fire weapons, and then the aviation, just overwhelming ranks of fighter attack aircraft. So I give them a lot of credit for withdrawing as much of their men and material as they were able to get away with, and under that kind of pressure in particular, I think that's pretty respectable soldiering.
Yeah, it's pretty exceptional getting that all through the Fillet Gap there, how they did that. We got a question in the chat from Tank Colonel Jay Bessie, one of our instructors at Command Staff College. He's talking on deception. And, was there a discernible Allied deception plan? And I'm assuming this in the context of COBRA. And if so, was it executed or impactful?
Yeah, well, the one that we alluded to is the one that gets all the press, right? Which is Fortitude, and that was significant because it wound up pinning the better part of the German mobile forces up around the Pas de Calais until it was too late. So that was huge. That was Patton's Ghost Army. For Cobra proper, it was more about the sequencing of sort of punching with both fists between the American and the British sectors, which is why Goodwood, only a few days before Cobra, was such an important thing, because it drew the Germans' attention in ways that prohibited them from being able to shift forces back and forth between the two sectors. The British actually launched a corps-size attack on the same day as Cobra as well, which doesn't get a lot of press, but it got the Germans' attention long enough for that hole to be rent. And that's not exactly deception. It's more about just clever sequencing. I am not aware of anything that, I'm just kind of running through my mental Rolodex here. I can't think of a good example of a tactical deception in support of the breakthrough. But I would say that for our wargamers and our planners, this problem set that we're looking at here for this case is basically modern war. It's been the problem since 1900. The Russo-Japanese War was this, World War I was this, World War II was this, the Ukraine today is this. This is not going to go away until something fundamental changes with the way we fight and our tools. Because when peer competitors meet and they go static, then one side or the other has got to find a way to go mobile again if they're going to try to get to whatever it is they're trying to aim at beyond where the lines have solidified. And what's interesting about this case study is I'm gonna pop back to the let's see if we can get this. It's funny, I can work one thing and then I can't work another, right? So now I'm having trouble with slide movement. Oh, come on. All right, there we go. Yeah, so this was the original plan for Cobra, the initial bid for success, and there's two ways you can do that. I mean, first of all, the fires were important, the massing was important. Surprised in terms of they didn't think that it was going to be done here because the ground was terrible. But the other thing is, you could also gain positional advantage nowadays. You could do that through either airborne, air assault, or amphibious forces to get behind and sort of work this from two different directions. And that is high-level planning and execution. But an amphibious assault that comes across and works in this direction from west to east isn't actually an option here, just like once you pass this through this crust, working from east to west is an option. And oh, by the way, the planners in Bradley's army planned that. And so they had an airborne and amphibious option ready to deploy if this did not go the way they hoped it was going to.
Yeah, I was not tracking that one. Let's see. We got Lieutenant Commander Neckett. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. Great overview, sir. I have one question. The Operation COBRA was finished before the end of July, and on 6th of August, it finished the battle for the Can. And immediately one day after that, the Germans make a counterattack at what's the name, at Moritz. So
Mortain.
basically, what is how much the Battle of Caen influenced the state of mind of Germans to have the counterattack? Because during the Second World War, Germans had a lot of counterattacks. Basically, for them, the best defense is offense. So I just curious about their state of mind, especially for this game. If they are going to, usually the best defense for them is a let's say, the counterattack and try to offense, even sometimes or in many times, basically, they had the decisive defeat, you know.
Yes, that's a good question. So Khan was enormously important. The fighting around there was a real the attrition that took place on that side of the line was enormous. To include the Goodwood, which we looked at briefly, but that wasn't the only one. The city fighting for the city proper, and then all the tanks and guns that were employed, the massive carpet bombing, all of that focused German attention. So it was with great reluctance that the Army Group commander decided to begin to move formations from that side of the field over to try to stem this penetration that had taken place with Cobra via the Mortain counterattack. And there was a lot of debate about it. What the commanders were afraid of was what we saw happen. They knew that if they, first of all, that it was insufficient mass. Secondly, they knew that if they stuck their neck out too far, they were liable to get it cut off once additional breakthroughs happened on either side of the shoulder. And this whole time, the Brits and the Canadians and the Poles are just grinding away outside of Caen, trying to get to Falaise, because that was their aim point. And meanwhile, once this counterattack fails, it's off to the races for Patton's army in particular, because the original plan was to put Patton's army into Brittany because they thought they were going to need all those ports for logistic reasons. They realized by mid-July that the throughput over the beaches in Normandy, and then with Cherbourg coming online, that their throughput was sufficient for the moment. And in point of fact, a lot of those Brittany ports spent the rest of the war under siege, and really were of no use to anyone. But it didn't absorb Patton's army, freeing it up as a sort of a branch plan to let them race to try to cut off the Germans and get up to that D+90 line along the Seine River, and hopefully either with a short hook or a long hook to be able to cut off the better part of the German army and destroy it south and west of Paris. And they nearly accomplished that at Falaise. So your question is, what role did it play? It played a huge role. They were very reluctant, but they knew they had to do this. It's either that or they need to go north of the river, and Hitler wouldn't allow them to go north of the river at that point. So until it became a fait accompli, this was their best bid for success and also their most glaring opportunity for disaster, which is pretty much what we see happen as the pocket unfolds. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much on your answer.
Yeah, that's this is an interesting dilemma that all of us will face in the game as well, because there's definitely a desire with these German panzer divisions that are, some of them are going to be relatively strong in the game, and you feel like you want to punch those Allied units and inflict at least a blunting effect on the attack and do some kind of counterattack. And I have seen in the game unfold where those counterattack like that can be used very effectively, but quite often, if you really commit that counterattack force, you're going to end up losing it because it just gets stuck behind the lines and enveloped. So it's a really tough decision here whether the Germans counterattack or not. And clearly, we have the historical example from this. Lieutenant Colonel Bessie, and then we've got a question on the French resistance in the chat.
Thanks, Mr. Barrick. And Dr. Morris, thanks again. Appreciate your notes on the deception effort as well. So this one is kind of a follow-up as, given those planning goals, would you consider this operation to have had catastrophic success? If so, what could be accounted for that? I think I heard a combination perhaps of proper campaigning and sequencing, but also dynamic decision-making. It's got to play into that somewhere. Or did one kind of cover for the others? Your thoughts? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's a mixed bag, isn't it? Because on the one hand, mass has a quality all of its own for sure, and they had that. They just kept feeding forces across the channel into the grinder, the attrition battle around the bridgehead, and the Germans were bleeding out without the reinforcements available. You know, they could replace maybe 1 man out of 5 over this period. So their combat power is dwindling, and that includes all of it. The ground fires, the aviation. They didn't have much of a navy, but just the fact that the Americans and the Brits had so much power was important. Their planning, you know, I think COBRA was clever. I think Goodwood was very clever. Goodwood founded, and that's why I wanted to go back to this, and it ties to the last question too. This picture here, you know, Goodwood foundered on great defense, and this is kind of a mobile defense in depth. I mean, not these defensive villages here, these nests are certainly stationary, but there was a lot of moving around here by the Panzer and anti-tank formations, along with the counterattack by Dietrich's corps. So, you know, if you're looking for a model for how to fight a defense like this, especially against both an infantry and an armor-heavy opponent like the Allies were, I think this is about as good as it gets. But they didn't have enough to replicate this all the way across the front. And so they made the logical decision and put a different kind of formation out where the Americans were in the COBRA sector. Now, you know, at the tactical level, probably Panzer Lehr shouldn't have been, you know, up in the front lines with tanks dug in up to their turrets and some of the things that they did, because that robbed them of their immediate counterattack forces. But in the end, I don't think it would have mattered because they were just overwhelmed in numbers. You would have had to have a formation that looks more like this one arrayed against COBRA to have any hope of success. So both depth and also great mobility for that counterattack, which the last questioner highlighted. Yeah, I mean, catastrophic success. I think so. In general, I would characterize this as it's certainly about as good as we as Americans have ever done. I think the perfect version of this is still out there. You know, if they had closed that pocket, and that's why it's such a controversial thing, if they had closed that pocket more effectively, they might have been able to do more damage to the stabs and some of the leadership that got away, in addition to all the equipment that was not able to get away. But that's, you know, that's like saying that, I don't know, I feel like this is a 95 and we're wishing we had a 98 on our test score here. It's pretty good execution, but I feel like they had all the tools to be able to do it. The most interesting question to me is what prepped these commanders to be able to do it. Almost every one of the American division commanders, corps commanders, army commanders, and their chiefs of staff, most of their G3s, G5s, those kind of people were graduates of CGSC at Leavenworth. And so if you look back in the 20 years before this war, that's where they learned how to do this. They certainly weren't doing it in exercises because they didn't have anything to play with. That's what's fascinating for where we are right now, because this is the place where we learn how to do things like this in war games, in games like you all are doing here, planning exercises and the rest. America's School for War, Schifferle's book, is a wonderful read that talks about how these officers were prepared to do this kind of fighting at corps and army group level.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. Go Army, and God bless anybody who has to face El Jefe 50 on the tournament. Thank you.
That's classic. Let's see, we've got a question in the chat about the French resistance. Was there a deliberate plan to incorporate the French resistance in the deep space? What, if any, impact did the resistance have during this operation? And then we'll follow it up with El Jefe's question.
Great. Didn't only, I think, alluded to it. So the French resistance was enormous, and there was a deliberate plan. And they looked at it as value added, but basically gravy. And they did not look at the French resistance as being a vital component of the plan, which I think is prudent. But they knew that if they resourced it correctly, it could be. And they did resource it correctly. with all sorts of things like Jedburgh teams and OSS, and the very people that were outside our gate here at Prince William Park learning how to do this, then went into France and helped those resistance groups across the whole political spectrum, by the way, which is another interesting story. But they had probably as much or nearly as much effect on delaying German operational reserves flowing towards this fight during this period as did the air forces. And that's saying a lot. So it was huge. And there was no German force that wasn't doing a combat movement. Never mind being hunted by Typhoons and Mustangs and things. It was also being hunted by little bands of locals that had the explosives and the weapons to be able to take out logistics convoys and attack small detachments. So there was no front line really for the Germans because of this, and it took them off their game in a major way. And there's some really good studies. There's a section in the Green Book on breakout and pursuit. There's a section in Blumenson's book. And by the way, for those of you that don't spend time with those, all the service histories are great, but the Army Green Book series from World War II is probably as good as we'll ever see in terms of official histories. And there's a wonderful section that talks about the French resistance and the outsized impact they played given the relative, compared to everything else that we were investing in, the relative paucity of resources that the Allies invested in. Some really wonderful people obviously are doing, our SAS guys and our OSS guys, men and women, were doing great work, but it wasn't a huge effort compared to all the other things that were focused on, at Army group level. So it's a great question.
Yeah, and a quick follow on from Stephen Bloodsworth on that. Is this an operation that our soft forces study for future peer-on-peer operations?
I don't know, but it should be, just because of the answer to that last question. And of course, SOF in terms of direct action can do so much more in order to complement that. But with the unconventional part of this and the sort of Green Beret kind of mission, that this is classic. Italy is a totally different kind of a chemistry character, but similar things are going on there. And you have everything from Popsky's Private Army to to the SBS and the SAS and the American versions of all this. It's really a fascinating study. So I can't think of a theater, the Philippines, Burma, Italy, same things going on the Eastern Front, France, where these guys and gals aren't doing amazing work, and it really is outsized. I think that's the only fair way to put it. Very, very dangerous, very, very risky. But when you're dealing with people that want to fight and don't want to be occupied by the Germans or whomever, Japanese, whoever it may be, then it's just laden with potential.
Great. El Jefe, over to you.
Hey, gentlemen, thanks again for all of your for this briefing going on today. So I want to go back to following up on COBRA and excellent campaigning. So I spent the past year here at CGSC studying a lot of the bulge. I role-played J. Lawton Collins for a staff ride, and I like to think of Operation COBRA as a parallel to the Battle of the Bulge, where during COBRA, it's the Allied forces that are able to mass at the center in order to create a penetration. Well, it's the Germans who get to accomplish that later in the Bulge. But a key difference in the outcome of the battles that you can see, it's not just campaigning, it's superior organization and flexibility built into your organization. So when the Allies penetrate at COBRA, as you already mentioned, sir, the Germans are essentially paralyzed in responding. Von Kluge is able to muster some reinforcements to pinch off the penetration, but it's divisions allocated piecemeal, not enough to stop 7th Corps. Versus, compare it to the Bulge when the Germans are the ones with operational surprise. Eisenhower identifies that it is the primary avenue of attack within the first 24 hours. The Germans estimated it would take a minimum of 2 weeks because that was their decision cycle. And the difference in response then becomes Ike Eisenhower takes the 7th Corps headquarters, and the Army is structured at this time to very dynamically move Corps headquarters across the theater. moves them all the way from the northern sector of AO to where Ike anticipates the battle occurring on 24 December, and then allocates them local divisions plus one division just arriving off the boat. A completely different approach to how you pinch off a penetration. The Allies experience excellent success pinching it off at the bulge. The Germans aren't able to the Axis aren't able to muster anything reasonable to stop Cobra. Over.
Those are great points. The thing I would just observe is that when you have a lot in the cupboard and you have the organizational flexibility and the leadership to be able to employ it wisely, it gives you possibilities. You know, I would argue that here at Cobra, as soon as the Germans rob Peter to pay Paul to mount a counterattack of any size, core up, against this breach through the Cobra sector, they have just denuded their forces on the other side of the line, and the Brits are just, you know, recocking for the next punch. So that's the beauty of having sufficient forces to be able to do that, whether you're operating from an interior or exterior position. To be able at the bulge, for example, to whistle up Patton and tell him to left face and you go in a different direction, or any of the other redeployments that are made in support of that counterattack, is beautiful. It's a beautiful thing to see, and it should be, I think, mother's milk to us. I mean, not that we take it for granted. You got to organize, train, equip to be able to do that, but that's the sort of thing that we want to aspire to be able to do. Another analogy that I would suggest for us to think about is, if you think about, say, Guderian coming across in May, June 1940 at the Meuse crossing, and then also doing a stage right and heading for the Channel. What's the difference between a movement like that of core size and a movement like this, where they're at Mortagne trying with all they can to get down to the, to the hinge at Avranches in the bay? And I think the difference is, kind of goes back to what you just said. The difference is, in 1940, you've got the rest of that German army coming behind, even if they're marching, as opposed to maybe riding. So that Panzer Corps is just the tip of the spear. It is not the whole, weapon. Whereas here, this Panzer Corps had basically nothing behind it. And if you have nothing behind you, then you may be able to do a glorious ride into the hinterlands, but it's going to be hard to, to recover and back up this hinge point, even if you're able to temporarily reconnect it. And that's what's missing here. You needed another 50 or 60 divisions probably in France at this point that are available for the Germans to play with, and that would have been a different story. It likely would have ended the same way. It might have been a lot longer of bleeding out along the lodgement area, or perhaps some other thing would have happened in a more mobile environment like this one that would have seen different kinds of outcomes. But as long as the Allies are able to overmatch in terms of force structure, deploying it wisely should lead to victory. And again, I don't want to belittle any of that. It doesn't happen automatically. It takes a lot. It takes a lifetime of study to be the man at the hour, to be ready to do what a J. Lawton Collins or Patton or any one of these figures that are making these decisions in real time. Last thing I'll say about this is just remember that the planning that takes place for this, if you go back and look at the versions of these plans, they look like the Sears and Roebuck Christmas catalog. I'm dating myself. Most of you probably don't even remember what that looked like, but they're several inches thick of planning documents. But as soon as they break out of this bridgehead, they're going to 1- and 2-page orders with an overlay. And it's fun to go to the archives and pull those things and look at them and see what 3-star commanders, corps level commanders fighting 3, 4, 5, 6, sometimes 7 divisions are doing with a couple of pages of information. And they're putting this out every day or every other day. Battlefield circulation in the day, put out the order at night, it goes out in the night, and they're executing the next morning. That's another kind of planning, and it's a kind of planning that we should not turn a deaf eye and ear to in PME environments, because that's required once you get into mobile operations. Over.
Dr. Morris, thank you. I'm gonna wrap up with the last question here, and then we'll call it a day. And first, I want to say before throwing this question out there, thanks for doing this. And this exactly hit kind of the launch point for this WARPLAN 44 tournament that I was hoping for by inviting you on. So thank you for that. This is a great way to kick this off. So the question I have, we have a little bit of an ahistorical aspect to our war game scenario in that we've got 3 Allied airborne divisions reconstituted back in the UK that the Allied player at certainly beyond turn 2 at some point in the game, they're able to employ should they wish. And I know historically those didn't get employed till the end of September with Market Garden. I was wondering if you've come across anything in your studies about any thought during this time frame to employing those airborne divisions that were in the UK, or were they just in a strategic reserve rebuilding status and really not ready until Market Garden? Do you have any observations on that?
I don't, other than to say, and I'm going to see if I can find something that'll maybe illustrate this better. Yeah. Early in the planning, and this is really before D-Day, they were trying to figure out what to do with airborne, and Marshall and others were looking at really deep options, including to the east of this map. So somewhere out in here, between here and Paris, they were looking at dropping divisions out that far, which, of course, I think the consensus is now that that would have been a disaster. And they wound up using them to do, what we know, which is pretty much behind Utah Beach and then off on the flank with the British and on around Pegasus and that area. So that's kind of ops normal for World War II for the way they were actually employed. I mean, the only thing I'll say is that airborne forces can do some interesting things, and one of the things that I mentioned about positional advantage and helping break through, make a penetration work. You can do it with fires. You can do it with, we talked about amphib and airborne and air assault. Imagine if, for example, one of the American divisions, even a regiment of one of those divisions, had been sprinkled across the backside of what we know as Omaha Beach instead of behind Utah Beach, with a mission of attacking towards the landing force. It's fun to think about. The geometries are interesting, but when you're being attacked on, from 2 different sides, that can be a game changer. So airborne forces have capabilities that were seldom used in that way. I can't really think of a good example like that. Usually what they're doing is they're securing bridges and trying to facilitate exits across tough terrain and that sort of thing. So as your gamers think through the options with these, don't limit yourself to just the way they use them. I don't think I would go as far as Marshall, who was so keen on putting them 100 miles inland. I certainly wouldn't recommend that, because I think that is a bridge too far for sure, even worse than the real one at Market Garden. But I'm just not aware of anything in that intermediate period for ways that were considered about, to use them in a way that helped the unfolding of this campaign. Remember, one of the challenges is during the pursuit, they were outrunning their lines of communication early on, and then later, the Red Ball Express and all of that. So aircraft could deliver about 2,000 tons a day of supplies of whatever kind of supplies, beans, bullets, Band-Aids, gas. And that wasn't much, because a Mark I Mod 0 division in those days was taking 600 to 700 tons a day. So that's like a core size that airlift could do. But anything that airlift was being used to haul supplies for is now not available, for the rehearsals and the execution of a drop mission like that. So there's a tension there during this period between the initial jobs and then obviously Market Garden a bit later when they went for that very ambitious Monty operation. And that's about all I can say, but it's a great asset, and if you can figure out a way to use it, you know, you should, because there's nothing worse than a bunch of pissed off paratroopers in the middle of the night.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Morrison. We did have a couple questions to chat, but gentlemen, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. We've been going for almost an hour and a half, and so thank you once again, Dr. Morris, for doing this. For those on here or that are going to listen to this on video later, wish you the best. I do want to say that the allies, playing the allies in this game is fun in this scenario. I think you get a lot of assets and resources that you can put into the fight. As the Germans, it is very professionally challenging, and I enjoy playing the Germans in a kind of sense that knowing it is a hard workout and the decisions are hard. It is no easy day, and every time you open up that game report for your turn, it's like a helmet fire when you're playing this game, and fighting this defensive action on the German side is going to really stretch your decision making. So be excited about that, but don't be surprised when you have to make a morale check on yourself when you open up your turn report and what happened in the Allied turn. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us on this, and I look forward to our next session that will be focused on Market Garden, hopefully. And until then, thanks a lot and appreciate you everybody plugging in.
Thanks, Tim. All the best, everyone.
Thanks.